She slid a check across the kitchen table like it was nothing. $50,000. Leave my son, she said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather. And this is yours by Friday. I stared at the number so long the ink almost blurred in front of my eyes, and then I did something that made her practiced smile disappear in half a second. I picked up the pen and I signed my name right next to hers. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and 6 months ago, I was the woman everyone in Charleston, South Carolina, quietly felt sorry for. Not because anything terrible had happened to me, because of who I loved and where I came from. I grew up in a double-wide trailer outside of Somerville, raised by a mother who cleaned houses for a living and a father who left before I could remember the sound of his voice. We didn't have much. Some winters, much meant knowing exactly which stores let you return, groceries if the card declined at checkout. But my mother had a saying she repeated so often it became part of my bones, something she'd whisper while folding laundry that wasn't even ours. Nobody remembers where you started. They only remember where you landed. I held on to that sentence like a lifeline through every school year where my shoes were a size too small, and every summer I spent babysitting instead of vacationing. Daniel Whitfield was different from anyone I'd ever known. Old Charleston money, a family name that opened doors just by being spoken out loud in the right rooms. We met at the community college library of all places, where he was tutoring students for extra credit and I was studying between 2 shifts at a diner off Rivers Avenue. He never once made me feel small for the hours I worked or the car I drove. That was Daniel. His mother was a different story entirely. When he introduced me to Eleanor Whitfield at their lake house that first summer, she looked at my department store dress and my chipped manicure the way you'd look at a stain on white carpet, something to be quietly, efficiently removed. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Women like Eleanor destroy you with a smile and a compliment. That isn't really a compliment at all. For 3 years, I told myself her coldness would thaw eventually, the way ice does if you're just patient enough. I told myself Daniel's love was enough to outweigh his mother's quiet campaign to remind me, at every dinner, every holiday, every family photograph where I stood slightly outside the frame, that I did not belong in that house and never would. I was wrong about almost all of it. And the check, sitting on that kitchen table, was only the very beginning of exactly how wrong I was. Daniel found out about the check 3 days later, not from me, but from his mother herself, who apparently couldn't resist telling him what she'd done over Sunday dinner, expecting praise instead of the silence that followed. He drove to my apartment that night with his tie still loose around his neck and asked me one question. Did I take the money because I actually wanted to leave? Or because I was scared of a woman who had spent 3 years making sure I never forgot I didn't belong? I told him the truth. I took it because I was tired of being examined like a purchase Eleanor regretted, tired of watching him defend me quietly instead of loudly, tired of loving a family that only pretended to tolerate me when the cameras, so to speak, were on. He asked me to tear up the check. I couldn't. Not because of the money, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone in that family had finally told me the truth about how she really felt. And something about that honesty, ugly as it was, felt like air after years of holding my breath. We broke up 2 weeks later, quietly without dramatics. The way things end when both people already know it's over before either says it out loud. I moved out of the apartment we'd started sharing and back into a 1-bedroom, above a dry cleaner on King Street, the kind of place where you can hear every conversation your neighbors have through walls thin as paper. I deposited the check. $50,000 felt like both nothing and everything at once. It was enough to survive on for a year if I was careful. It was nowhere near enough to build the kind of life that would make Eleanor Whitfield regret writing it. I found out I was pregnant 4 weeks after the breakup, standing in a CVS bathroom with a test I'd paid for in quarters. I'd been saving in a mason jar since childhood habit never quite left me. I sat down on the closed toilet lid and I laughed. The kind of laugh that isn't happiness. It's just your body trying to release pressure that has nowhere else to go. I never told Daniel. Not out of cruelty, but because I already knew exactly what would happen if I did. Eleanor would find a way to make this too. Disappear quietly and efficiently, the way she made everything inconvenient disappear. I sat in that small apartment above the dry, cleaner with a positive pregnancy, test in one hand, and a check for $50,000, already spent down to $31,000, and I made a decision that would change absolutely everything Eleanor Whitfield thought she understood about the woman she paid to disappear. I had exactly $31,000, a baby coming in 7 months, and one skill nobody in the Whitfield family had ever bothered to ask me about. I could bake, not hobby baking, real baking, the kind my mother taught me on a stove with 2 working burners, the kind that got me through community college by supplying 3 different coffee shops with pies they sold under their own name. I started small, a folding table at the Charleston Farmers Market on Saturdays, pies and hand pies wrapped in wax paper with a handwritten sign that said, Bennett's Kitchen. My first Saturday, I made $211 and cried in my car afterward, not from sadness, but because it was the first money I'd ever made that belonged entirely to me. The next 8 months were not a montage. They were closing early because I was too sick to stand. They were a landlord raising my rent by $200 the same week my oven broke. They were nights doing inventory with my feet, propped up because they'd swollen past recognition, calculating flour costs against a due date that kept getting closer whether or not. I was ready. My daughter Emma was born in March, 6 pounds 4 ounces, and 3 weeks later I was back at the market with her strapped to my chest, selling pies to strangers who had no idea. They were talking to a woman who used to eat holiday dinners in a house that made her feel like furniture. A local bakery owner named Marcus Webb, an older man who'd built his own shop from nothing 40 years earlier, started buying a pie from me every Saturday without fail. 6 months in, he offered me commercial kitchen space at night, after his ovens went cold, in exchange for a small percentage once I turned a real profit. It wasn't charity. He told me straight out he'd seen 100 people with talent and exactly one person who showed up every single Saturday no matter what. That was the difference, he said, between a hobby and a business. By Emma's first birthday, Bennett's Kitchen had a real storefront, a small one on a side street off Cannon, with 4 employees and a wholesale contract with 2 local grocery chains. I hadn't spoken to Daniel in over a year. I hadn't spoken to Eleanor since the day I signed that check. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known standing in my little shop counting register drawers at midnight, was that Eleanor Whitfield had just found out about Emma, and that she was already making plans of her own to make. Sure, my daughter never inherited a single thing that had the Whitfield name attached to it. Eleanor found out about Emma through a mutual friend at church, and instead of calling me, she called a lawyer. I received a letter 3 weeks later, dense with legal language, essentially stating that since Daniel's name wasn't on the birth certificate, and since I had accepted money in exchange for leaving the family, Emma had no legal claim to the Whitfield estate, present or future. She wasn't protecting Daniel. Daniel didn't even know he had a daughter yet. She was protecting money from a child she'd never met. I didn't call a lawyer back. I called Daniel myself for the first time in over a year, and told him everything. The pregnancy, the birth, the reason I'd stayed silent. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked if he could see her. Not the estate, not the paperwork, her. He showed up at my shop the next day, and when Emma wrapped her small hand around his finger, I watched something break open in his face that his mother's money had never once been able to buy. Eleanor requested a meeting after that, expecting, I think, the same frightened girl who used to shrink at her dinner table. Instead, she walked into a shop with her name on the window, 4 employees calling me boss, and a wholesale contract that had just tripled in size. I told her I didn't need her approval anymore, and I didn't need her money either. I still had $31,000 of it sitting untouched in a savings account, because some part of me always knew I'd give it back the day I no longer needed it to survive. I wrote her a check that afternoon, full amount, and slid it across a table for the second time in both our lives. Except this time, I was the one who got to walk away first. Daniel and I didn't get back together. Not right away, but he became the father Emma deserved. And eventually, slowly, something real rebuilt itself between us on our own terms. Not his mother's, Bennett's. Kitchen now has 3 locations across the Charleston area, and Marcus Webb still buys the first pie off the tray every Saturday morning, same as he did the day he decided to bet on me. I think about my mother's words often now, standing in a kitchen that has my name on the door. Nobody remembers where you started. They only remember where you landed. Eleanor, Whitfield paid $50,000 trying to erase me from her son's life. Instead, she funded the exact beginning of a woman she'd spend the rest of her life having to respect. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know what you would have done in my shoes. Tell me in the comments below. And if you believe in second chances, in building something real out of nothing, hit that like button and subscribe, because next week, I'm telling you about the phone call that finally brought Eleanor to my front door uninvited and asking for something I never thought she'd have the nerve to ask for.